everybody. Let's take a look at Canvas. We're October 13th. Today your readings were Republic Book 3, finish it, and all of Book 4. Last week you read half of Book 3, we didn't quite get to it. I posted our discussion from last week there. A couple weeks before our next papers are due, I'll be posting them soon, I imagine. I also posted digital images of the stories we were discussing last week. This is Cronus castrating his father, Saturn in Latin. I already forget what the Greek is.
Uranus.
Is it? How weird is that? That's so strange. So Uranus is the Greek. Saturn is the Latin. So Robert, if I get this correct, these are the same deity in two different languages, but two different planets for us. What were those astronomers thinking, huh? Crazy. So there's one. I also included, this is my personal favorite here, Reuben. This is Rubens. Ugh, I made a mistake in his name. Rubens, Kronos eating his children. That's not actually my favorite. My favorite is Goya's. That's even better. Look at that. Awesome. Now, of course, what's curious is, of course, that we know, according to the story, which we discussed last week, when Zeus gives the emetic to his father to save the children, they pop out one after the other, fully formed, undevoured, in other words. So Goya did not pay attention to the story, but that's neither here nor there. So I have a question for you all. Why do you think, maybe this is a question for your art history classes, or maybe you've learned a thing or two in your art history classes. Why is Goya inspired? Why would inspire someone to be like, you know what, that's a great fucking story. I'm going to paint that. Anybody have any thoughts on that? What would inspire Rubens or Goya to paint this?
This could be completely wrong because I don't know history and like time periods.
I don't know the answer either. I'm just throwing it out there.
I was gonna say a lot of art is inspired by like religion, so they might have believed in this, or it might have just like inspired them as a story. I don't know.
Well, not Rubens and Goya were not, no, they were Christian. They would not have believed in this. I mean, they would not have believed in the mythology, but they felt the need to replicate this clearly. Any other thoughts? No? Too soon? Well, that's something for you to think on. I'm often wondering, oh, we have some things in the chat here. Maybe sorry, Lauren, I don't understand what you're saying. Maybe the question.
It was a typo, I meant that, but.
So what is your point?
Just like it was a common thing to depict things like myths. Like there's not a whole lot of interpretation in there. I was just saying that maybe that had something to do with it since it was considered kind of an academic thing.
Good. Well, I might approach this from a different angle, and you know, the reason, and I'll recall why we were discussing this. Why we were discussing the story of Kronos. Well, how about someone tell us, why were we talking about the story of Kronos? Why did that come up? Who remembers the context of our conversation?
Wasn't it when Socrates was talking about how the Greek gods and a lot of their actions are like not to be condoned or glorified because they were so like horrible?
Nice. High five. All right, there's part. There's more. There's more though. You got to start it, Anna. Let me hear more. You're absolutely right. Socrates was not happy with these stories about the gods. All right, who's talking?
That's me. I was gonna say that he is specifically trying to like ban them from his perfect city because he doesn't want, for instance, children or young adults or anything who hears these stories to be wrongly influenced by them.
I love it. That's right, Audrey. Yeah. By the way, just a side note, I'm very disappointed in myself. At the end of class last week, I was like showing you pictures of these paintings on the camera. What the fuck is the matter with me? We're using the internet here. Don't ever let me do this again, everybody. Come on, I could have Googled that shit, posted it for everybody to see. That was really, really lame. But Audrey's right. The topic was in building this ideal city, and this is specifically about the Guardian class. He spends a lot of time discussing the training of the Guardian class. They're the class that he spends the most time fretting about, interestingly enough, far more than the craftsmen, than the artisans, who are the bedrock, I could say, of this population of this city. And even more than the ruling class, arguably. We'll talk, well, there may be plenty to say about the ruling class. We'll see. That's coming next week. And by the way, this utopian city is a pyramid. You know, the artisan class is by far the biggest population. Then you have the guardians and the ruling class on top of that. We'll talk about where they come from today. And the guardian class, the education of this guardian class is very, very important. He says that the guardians, and one other conversation I want us to have again is to resituate ourselves, is in the conversation about the nature of people and the kind of jobs they should do. The guardians have specific traits that distinguish them as guardians and that most importantly qualify them as guardians. Guardians, we're talking about a warrior class, okay? He says among the things that the guardians must learn, philosophy, gymnastics, poetry. That will probably sound surprising to our ears. I have a cousin who's a Marine. He does not really learn much gymnastics and poetry in the Marines. So what does Plato mean? Well, by gymnastics, the Greeks meant a form of exercise. And poetry, we know what he means. He means like the epic poems of Homer. He's talking about basically the stories that they're raised on. And they tell us that the guardians must learn false stories. That's what they must learn, false stories. And they must learn false stories of a specific kind. Let's see, I'll call your attention to the salient passage. This is in book 2. By the way, it's around line 378 that he talks about the example of Uranus, right? So they're discussing the kind of false stories they're going to tell. And he says, listen, these stories about the gods, this will not do. These are not appropriate. You can't have kids raised on stories of the gods eating their children. This is outrageous. But he says, 378c, he says, if we want the guardians of our city to think that it's shameful to be easily provoked into hating one another, we mustn't allow any stories about gods warring, fighting, or plotting. So we want to get rid of stories of the gods fighting against each other and plotting. which is a significant feature of the stories about the Greek gods we discussed. The Greek gods are, I like to think of them as almost superheroes. You know, they're very powerful, but they also have extreme human foibles and emotions. For those of you, I think anyone here raised in the American education system, you are familiar with those stories. You learn them, I think, in around 6th grade, at least in Maryland, as part of the 6th grade curriculum. Our international students maybe are less familiar with the stories of Greek gods. But the Greek gods, you know, they are an important feature underlying, Western civilization, frankly. I mean, as we saw in the paintings of Rubens and of Goya, these myths, much like the biblical stories, are really, you know, important touchstones for much civilization for centuries and centuries and centuries. These myths are referred to repeatedly. Any case, but you'll see what he says here. We don't want these stories of the gods plotting and fighting with each other. Why? Because we want the guardians of our city to think that it's shameful to be easily provoked into hating one another. We do not want the guardians to be provoked into hating one another. And he goes on, for they aren't true. The battles of gods and giants and all the various stories of the gods, hating their families or friends, should neither be told nor even woven in embroideries. If we're to persuade our people that no citizen has ever hated another, and that it's impious to do so, then that's what should be told to children from the beginning by old men and women. And as these children grow older, poets should be compelled to tell them the same sort of thing. So consider that goal. This is the goal. We want to persuade our people that no citizen has ever hated another. What do you think about that goal? Is that a good lesson to be teaching children?
I think like maybe that, I mean, like that's another example, right, of his noble lies. But I think like going back like one point previously, like not teaching them the stories of like the Greek gods probably, I think that that could be a good thing. Like it clearly they do cause a lot of conflict. And I mean, the way that religion is framed in like Western world, it's supposed to be like an example for which to live your life by. And it's like, you know, maybe not absolutely in like a scholarly sense, but like to the like the common religious person, they aspire to like, you know, live up to the expectations of the church and whatnot. And like then the church itself isn't actually setting an example for people, and it can be very harmful. And like I know also like a lot of conflict arises from like disagreement in religion, you know, and like imagine if there was like a second Greek god, like sect of Greek gods, and like then they started like arguing over which is the true Greek god, and then you have Palestine and Israel, and it turns into a whole shit show really quick.
Okay. Any other thoughts on whether that is what do you guys think of his goal? That the goal is to teach the children that nobody in the city hates one another.
I think it's kind of the way that he frames it. Like at first, it feels very much like censorship because he's saying, yeah, we need to make sure that every story that every child is told is controlled. But at the same time, it's like he doesn't really believe he's changing any of the stories. He's just kind of getting rid of the ones that are false. Because like his claim is that, well, these can't be true because gods are all good. So at least to him, it's something that's necessary because he seems to think that all of the stories about like higher beings having hatred for other beings and things like that are the root of issues, and getting rid of them means there isn't that sort of example that Cameron talked about. So
Good. So following what you said there, Lauren, I just typed this in the chat. Maybe instead of talking about censorship, should we be talking about social messaging? Is that what he wants his stories? Is that what he wants children's stories to do? I'm sorry?
Can you define that, social messaging?
I was taking my cue from Lauren. I think, Lauren, you mean like the messaging that certain traits and behaviors are preferred. that okay? And that certain behaviors are not. Maybe there's a better word. That's the word that came to my mind. But I like Lauren's point that it's less about censorship and more about presenting ideals. And I wonder if you guys would tell me anything about the stories you all were raised on. Do we still watch Dora the Explorer? Is that done? Was that done? My daughter was into that. Wait a minute. You guys are way more than Dora.
You got me thinking about Dora. I think they're redoing it because I know they're redoing Bob the Builder and stuff like that, bringing some stuff back.
My son was really into Bob the Builder. I had to suffer through a lot of Bob the Builder. I remember Clifford the Big Red Dog. I think I might lose some of our international students here. I apologize. I'll bring it back to topics I promise we can talk about. There's Disney. Everybody in the fucking world knows Disney. Is there social messaging in Disney? Is there preferred behavior? Is Disney doing what Plato would approve of? Or any of these we're talking about here?
Something to say that I wanted to bring up is like relating to social messaging with the pandemic. It occurred to me while reading book 3 that Socrates is really fucking ableist. He just is like, if you're chronically ill and you have a disease that cannot be cured in a moment's time, then dispose of yourself or something along those lines. Like he's like, basically like, if you can't be of use, like skill or craft wise, and you can't cure yourself, then you might as well just be dead. And I was thinking about that with social messaging with like Fox News and like, I don't know, just like media networks where it's like, don't pretend that the pandemic is happening, go back to work. If you can't cure COVID in a moment's time, like you're like, I don't know, I see a connection there. I also just really deeply rooted ableism in Socrates and whoever he was talking to, I forget, but he was like just eugenics basically. So that was disappointing to me.
I mean, didn't they say at one point if you like break your leg or something, then you like stop being a man because like you lose part of what makes you a person because you can't like walk anymore.
Find Vivian and Lydia, would you find the passages you have in mind? Robert?
Building on that, when I was reading like all of his things, it occurred to me that he doesn't really care about people as like individuals. He cares more about the state.
He says that much at the beginning of 4. Adeimantus says, I think the people in your city are be miserable. And he says, I don't care about individual happiness. I'm interested in the happiness of the whole, which suggests that which immediately means he's problematizing the relationship between them. Can you have the happiness of the individual together with the happiness of the whole, or are they mutually exclusive? Right. Plato should sound very different to our ears because we live in what's called a liberal democracy, which prioritizes individual freedom, right? The pursuit of happiness. That's how Thomas Jefferson put it. Thomas Jefferson is the opposite. He's not concerned in the happiness of the whole. The whole just has to hold. The whole just has to remain as a superstructure to contain us doing our own thing. Plato is a communitarian. He's interested in the interests of the community above all. And this is far before any notion of individuals and individual freedom. These ideas of individual freedom are just starting to bubble up in their minds at this point. It's not until the French Revolution 2 millennia later that you're really going to start hear it put in ways that sound familiar to us. As for his ableism, yeah, I mean, this would not have at all been unfamiliar in Plato's time. I mean, it was common practice among the Greeks that, I mean, just imagine if you had a child that was disabled in any way, or if they considered the child was undesirable, exposure was a common practice. You guys know what exposure means? They would just leave the baby on a hill, on a mountain, let the baby die. The story of Oedipus, the story of Oedipus Rex. Oops. You guys know the story of Oedipus Rex? He was the son of the king of, who knows?
I can't remember the name, but you're bringing back bad memories of English.
Thebes. There we go.
What's that one?
He was the king. He was the son of Thebes, and Tiresias, who was the blind hermaphrodite. Tiresias tells the king of Thebes, "Your son is going to kill you and marry your wife." And so, what does the king do? He says, "He's out of here." He leaves him to be exposed on a mountain, but a shepherd finds him and raises him. And then Oedipus makes his way back to Thebes, unbeknownst to him. He doesn't know. The prophecy kills his father, doesn't know it's his father at the time, marries his mother, doesn't know it's marries his mother at the time. And then Tiresias informs him, at which point he gouges out his eyes. Ableism, as you put it, would have been just a common fact of life at that time. And the Spartans were notorious for how they carried this out, right? The Spartans would dispose of children that they felt were not up to par. I'm often amazed at that. Life was so cheap back then, Just imagine your lifespan was probably 30 years old. Probably half of the children died by the age of 5. Probably half of the mothers died in childbirth. I'm always amazed that life was so cheap. In those days, I would have considered it to be more precious, but maybe that's my own contemporary prejudice, But I will say this, what's interesting though, is that it is the atmosphere of his time that ableism was, strong. You have to also understand that they did not have anything approaching our standards of medicine. So I often like to think about what life must have been like living back then with physical ailments. Just consider this. They had no medicine to alleviate pain. That doesn't come till the 1800s when aspirin is discovered. They had no dental care, ailments that we consider extremely basic today would have been deadly. I'll give you an example. I was watching a documentary a few years ago about Jamestown. Jamestown was one of the first settlements in Virginia. And the English settlers had a hell of a time. They had a famine. I think they even practiced cannibalism at one point. And in any case, a bunch of archaeologists were there, and they were excavating a graveyard, a burial ground of some of the settlers. And they opened up a grave of a body, and they discovered that this was a 17-year-old boy. And they found an arrow in shaft in the rib cage of this boy. So they said, well, that's what killed the boy. But then they looked at his teeth, and the archaeologist said he had an abscess in his tooth. And if that arrow didn't kill him, the abscess was going to kill him. So can you imagine? Nowadays, I have a cavity. Or I floss my teeth, first of all. Then I have a cavity. I go to the doctor, get that taken care of. There was a time and age when a cavity would kill you, right? So, I don't know. I just think it's always worthwhile trying to appreciate the physical conditions that people lived in particular, how people lived with pain. I think we're kind of wimpy. Sorry. And of course, I'm the first to reach for I feel a headache coming on. Reach for some ibuprofen. what the hell did they do in the old days? Maybe they just got drunk. But the ableism is a fact. There's no way around it. But I will say this. There is one philosophy school that comes out of Socrates, and it's called Stoicism. And the Stoics take a different approach. They maintain that whatever your talents are, even if they are limited by physical means, whatever, there is a task and a purpose, and they use the word duty for everyone, no matter what you're able for. And the reason I was asking Vivian and Lydia to find those passages for me, because, I think Socrates, he's kind of on the cusp here. As I said, there is a tradition coming out of him that is far more nuanced, but of course he is competing against the Spartans, who are definitively ableists, no doubt. Did you guys find those passages you're referring to?
Sorry, I did half audiobook, half book, so I
If you find it, no worries. Lydia, did you find anything?
I have been skimming through my my book online, and I don't know why I can't find it, but I remember I also did half audiobook, half half listening, half reading. I don't know why I can't find it.
If you guys find it, just let me know. But what the last thing I want to say on this topic is that the Spartans were the most shameless practitioners of ableism, okay? And as we're going to see next week in book 5, I'm not so certain Plato is down with what the Spartans are up to. I don't know that he's really on board. So just keep an eye on that. Sonny says, Plato says that doing one's work is just, or not doing or being unable to do one's work would make one unjust. His reasoning seems to imply ableism, but it could also imply the opposite, that whatever your talents are, there's something for you to do. But listen, there is, he is very un-PC in this respect. Plato is going to say, listen, and this was the ancient Mediterranean worldview. You are not free to do whatever you want. I'm sorry. You can't come into this world and say, I'm going to be a dancer. I'm going to be a president. I'm going to be a lawyer. Plato says, no. Nope. Let me see you. Oh, yeah, you're a baker. Fuck it. And that's what you got to do. Because if you're going to try and be a dancer and you suck, you're doing nobody a favor, least of all yourself. You're going to hate it. But you're really good at baking. Your nature provides clues as to what you should be doing in life. And when you do those things, when you listen to those clues and you fulfill your nature, you will find fulfillment. You will find happiness. And you will benefit the community as a whole. Right? Again, back to the point that he's communitarian. You will benefit the community by doing what you do best. Here we go. Lauren says, he didn't think that he should treat someone who couldn't live a normal life, since such a person would be of no profit either to himself or to the city. 407E. I'm just checking on the context of that. I mean, you guys are absolutely right. I mean, and I'm glad you guys understand this. The most important principle of the city is that you must do what you do well. And you don't mess around and you don't double dip. You do exactly one thing. And you do what you do best. Do you have any questions? to break you guys. I'm going to do the breakout. Okay. I think I figured out how to do a breakout. So I'm going to break you guys into groups. And I want you for about 10 minutes. And I want you all to discuss a topic because what we were talking about with people pretending that people do not have intrinsic value in their value and their value lies in their ability to contribute to the economy. Yeah. I mean, you don't matter as an individual, according to Plato. I'm sorry. It's tough. It's tough. But the Greek view is also a little bit different, which is, and Aristotle held to this view too, that there is no possibility for individual happiness if the community is not in order. They prioritize the community because they believe that individual happiness was contingent on that. We in this country, sorry, not only this country, but liberal democracies across the world, they prioritize the individual. And again, the task of the community, the state, is just to contain it all and not explode. That's it. Okay. But we'll get to that in a second. By the way, so, all right, everybody, this is what we're essentially going to be discussing in your breakout rooms. We're really going to talk about this essentialism again. Lauren, why'd you bring up pretending?
Just because, like, yeah, it feels very much like this is all completely Plato in his head. But if it is reflective of a lot of ideas that already were pretty widespread at the time, it's not necessarily like just the pretend product of his own thought experiment. It's kind of a mixture of all of those things.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I see what you mean now. Yeah. His utopia is also built, it's incorporating ideas he sees around him, And like I was saying, and I'm going to discuss this a lot next week, Sparta is a big motivator for him. And for very clear geopolitical reasons. That's the major opponent of Athens. It has taken over the city of Athens. And so naturally you would look to this city and say, what are they doing that we're doing differently? And Sparta was also engaging in practices that were really quite unusual that other cities were not doing. And they really prioritized the city and the community much more than the individual. Okay. All right, now back to essentialism. Essentialism is a bedrock position here of the Republic. Not only that, ancient Mediterranean thought. The idea of essentialism, again, is this idea that you have an essence. You have an essence that tells you what you should be doing. You have a nature, right? And so, okay, now, let me do this. And okay, there. These are the questions I want us all to consider in these breakouts. I'm going to send you all in your breakout rooms in just a second. Following Plato, what is the nature of an artist? And I have a footnote. You're not allowed to use the word creative. Don't you dare. Okay, everything but that word. What is the nature of an artist? What physical, intellectual, emotional traits should an artist have? And then in your groups, how is this notion problematic or controversial? The idea that an artist has a nature. Okay. So we're 139 right now. I will collect us all again in about 10 minutes. All right. I'll come visit you all.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm just spying. I'm going to mute.
Okay. So the nature of an artist without using the phrase or concept of creativeness.
I think one of the most critical things for an artist to be is to have the ability to think critically, because we have to like examine the world and then put forth like an opinion of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Exactly, man.
Yeah,
And
I
to
think-
add to that, I think like also it's essential we hold up a mirror to society, be to reflect its own image on itself to show it, its true image.
I think maybe artists themselves are quite often controversial. I mean, not always, but especially like in a modern sense of like what we consider like to be art, it's usually very controversial.
I'm going to ask you guys some questions based on what you just said. Henry says you need to be a mirror to society. Robert says you need to be critical and controversies involved. What are the traits on the part of people that make them disposed to that? Like what makes someone a good mirror? What makes someone a good critic? What makes someone able for controversy?
Do you mean like being an observer, somebody who observes society well and
You
is
guys
able
are
to look at
talking
it?
about the kinds of things that artists must do. I want you to back up even further and think about what are the traits, physical or emotional or intellectual, that make people be able to do that. Think in a platonic way.
Loud. I think artists need to be loud and outspoken. Not
Like you, Robert.
Always.
Loud hair.
need enforce your will upon the world, like
There we go. All right.
I think
Follow that. Follow Robert. I'm out.
Okay. I think
Otto, what are you doing?
Hands, I guess.
For sure. And I guess for emotional traits, just like being patient.
What do you guys have so far? I heard patience, passion. What else? Has anybody said steady hand? Does that help?
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
mentioned like being able to use your hands. But
In any old way? Are there specific ways you should be able to hold your hands or use them? I'm just asking questions. I have nothing in mind.
Depends what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
If like musicians are considered as artists, then yeah.
Good. There are different arts, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. You guys can talk also. Don't forget about what may be controversial in this notion. Okay. So maybe you can take that up next.
Like, yeah,
Oh, hello.
place.
I'm just spying. How's it going?
We're having the most trouble with option one, probably unsurprisingly.
What is the nature of an artist? Did you guys come up with certain traits?
Yeah,
Like what?
they have to be perceptive. They're intellectual. They should know what just and unjust is. Have empathy, patience.
Empathy and patience. Nice. How about physical traits?
That kind of came down to like what type of art one practices. Like a dancer or an actor needs a lot more physicality than, say, a visual artist. And visual art requires like sort of, you know, hand-eye coordination at times and things like that as well. So just depending on what you're doing, something that helps with that.
Awesome. Well, you guys have a few minutes left. Why don't you talk about what's controversial about this notion, okay? About the idea of having a nature. And I'm going to back out and check the other room. See ya.
Hi.
Kind of the same representations of myths.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I don't know. I still don't feel like there'd be a place for it in his little world. Hello.
Hey, you have 2 minutes. You should really be buckling down on the question, what is controversial about this idea of whether an artist has a nature?
We answered all three, and now we're just talking about how, regardless of all this, an artist probably would not be allowed in Plato's society. And
or better, well, he will allow some. The better question is, do you want to be an artist in his society? I guess that's the.
we were talking about how like he would only allow like socialist realism, pro-state, pro-community art, and not free-thinking like impressionist, like different kinds of art.
Interesting.
So
what kind
no,
of
I
what
wouldn't.
kind of traits did you guys come up with that are good for an artist to have?
I mean, we kind of, or do you want to go?
You can go.
Okay. we were kind of talking about how it's less of like a specific like adjective and more of a desire to reflect what you see around you and like sort of filter through your own consciousness and then send it back.
That's neat.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Just being a mirror. That's
Yep.
kind of how you described it, Sid.
I mean, not like a mirror, but more of like a weird personalized filter.
A refraction.
In my opinion.
Yeah. Well, you don't merely reflect, right? There's also a critical element.
Yeah.
Good. All right. I'm going to pull everybody together. See you in a minute. Sonny, are you in the kitchen today? Looks like a kitchen.
Oh, it's the laundry room, but from a different angle. So, yeah.
Sonny. Oh, we'll get you out of that laundry room soon, I promise. We're waiting another few seconds for everybody to come in. Cameron, who the hell is that?
This is our third roommate.
Wait, is he paying tuition for me? Because I don't know about this.
We're deciding what we want to make after this class.
What's your roommate's
Tight
name?
in this apartment.
What's your roommate's name?
Hey, my name is. What's up?
What's his name?
And yes, I'm paying.
That's what your name is.
David.
David.
Yep.
David.
Hello.
You're gonna get some wisdom now, David. You're lucky.
Oh.
All right. So we talked. So good. I heard some interesting things. I heard some nice points about, but you guys had some interesting points about what is the nature of artists. I heard a couple interesting things like that an artist, perceives, has special talent for perception and even reflection, but not in an uncritical manner. An artist Robert used the word is loud, right? An artist calls attention to certain things. I wonder if anybody used the word courageous? Because I think
Sonny did in our group.
yeah, I think artists are courageous. It takes courage to go to art school, right? What do you think?
We said crazy.
Yeah. You probably had family members, like maybe a grandma was like, art school. What are you talking about?
Art school gives a lot of money.
And then when you get to art school, you know, it's tough. Art school's tough, you know. It is a competitive atmosphere. So it takes courage. It takes courage to be the kind of social critics that artists can be. You have to go your own path. You know, you're not doing the button-down shirt, 9 to 5, living in the 2-bedroom rancher, you know, with the picket fence. Artists will be, you'll be doing your own things. So good. That was very interesting. But I want to hear now about what you guys had to say about the third part. How is this notion problematic or controversial?
We were saying in our group, like, it's not, this is in like through Plato's view, he definitely would not allow artists or all art in his little world. He would definitely be more akin to like, it was what time was it? It was in like I don't know. It was basically when like Stalin only allowed Soviet or socialist realism and only like pro-state, pro-government, non-individual art that like was almost a form of propaganda in a way. He definitely would be very against like pro-individual art and like, I mean, mostly like all art that's like critical, you know, through an individual lens. So I think in his sense, it would be problematic because it doesn't inherently contribute to the society as a whole.
Great. Anybody else? What'd you talk about in your groups about? Is there something controversial, problematic in the notion that an artist has a specific nature?
We talked about that since, like within Plato's view, like art is in a very controlled little sphere. But at least now and like in many other places, sort of throughout history, it kind of comes and goes. Art has such an expansive reach and like doesn't have a really concrete definition. Having like one nature for an artist is really limiting, just on the kinds of things that art can do.
Awesome. Cameron.
We were also talking about how saying that there's inherent qualities to an artist is limiting because it makes it seem like there's only certain people that can be artists, and it like stops the ability of people to decide and like become artists, which I think, I don't know, I feel like art is a very active process and like you're actively deciding to do it rather than just like being it.
Good. That's nice. Also, many of you were saying like the kind of traits, especially when it came to like physical traits of an artist, are dependent on, they will vary according to the different media. You know, sculptors need to be doing something different from painters, from digital artists and the like. What were the options open to him? I mean, what kind of art did he have in mind? What kind of art was completely alien to him? Obviously, huh? I mean,
clearly he didn't have like digital and like media arts.
Yeah.
I think he was probably most likely talking about like painting for the most part.
Mostly sculpture. I don't think that they had much. I mean, they would have had some painting, sculpture, mosaic. That's what they had in terms of visual arts. But then, of course, poetry, tragedy, comedy, the poets themselves. He talks about dithyrambs, which is, dithyrambs is one of the meters for poetry. I was thinking also, like, following on what Anna said, you know, if you have a certain vision of what art is, that might foreclose what you're able for prematurely. I mean, what if your specific abilities point to a medium that is beyond what Plato even conceives, right? Nowadays, we have so many different media. There's of course film, which they never would have considered photography, you know, and the various digital media arts. I mean, there's a, you know, I guess the point I'm saying is if you're going to insist that you're looking for only a certain selection of talents to qualify an artist, what if your talents point to a medium that is completely beyond the realm of, you know, his perception, you know, of his consideration? Just a thought. Anybody else? What is controversial? Anything controversial or problematic about the idea that that an artist will have a specific nature?
Well, I feel like Socrates would disagree with what I'm about to say, but I feel like you can kind of like, if you kind of dig down like deep enough, you can kind of define almost anything as art, and you can define kind of almost anyone as an artist. But Socrates would have a lot of problems with my saying that.
Why
and
do
I
you-
feel like that's more of like a modern kind of
Why do you
notion.
Why do you say that, Lydia?
Because, well, the way that I would say, like, the way that I define artist is like somebody who creates something for the sake of creating it. And that you can really kind of say that about anything. Like, you can say, like, I don't know, nature creates, you know, trees for the sake of creating it. Like, I create paintings for the sake of creating them. An architect creates, you know, buildings for the sake of creating them. So I don't know. It's like it's almost impossible to really define like what art is when you kind of think about it in that way. But Socrates, I feel like, would definitely disagree with that, because did he live during like the high classical period of like Greek art? I think he did.
Yeah, but you know what, Lydia? He wouldn't disagree with you very much, actually, because of the way you just put it. I mean, he would say to you, and this takes us to book 3, what is art? Right? That's what he'd say. What is art? And that is, you kind of set him up exact for his critique that comes in book 3. What is a baker? Not controversial. What's a butcher? Not controversial. What's a carpenter? Not controversial. What's an artist? He thinks that's very controversial. He thinks it's very much open to, it's ill-defined. That's his major critique, right? The more defined it is, the better. But let's wade into book 3 here. At this point, 'cause I think we need to dive in there. You know, so listen, art is a huge topic of the Republic. Every time I teach it, I'm amazed how central it is. You know, most scholars treat and view the Republic as a work of political philosophy, but really it is central to aesthetics, because and aesthetics is that division of philosophy that considers the meaning and nature of art, the meaning, nature, and purpose of art. Because he is unable to conceive of this ideal city without understanding what role art has in this city. So I'm going to walk us through a little bit of the beginning of book 3 here. He says here at the open of book 3, he's talking about, this is continuing the discussion about what the guardians must not hear. And he tells us that the guardians must not hear a vocabulary of terror and fear. This is line 387C. And why can't they hear that? Because we cannot have guardians who are sensitive and soft. These have to be some tough assholes, right? They cannot fear death and think that death is a bad thing. That implies, that's 388. That implies, again, a specific kind of narrative is appropriate for them. He's very critical of when Homer in the Iliad portrays the death of, well, not the death, Achilles. Achilles is anguished over the death of, I forget who, and I believe it is his lover in the Iliad. And this is 388 AC. Socrates says this is inappropriate. We cannot have guardian. We cannot have stories of guardians of great warriors like Achilles, of all people, crying over the death of anyone, nor should the poets portray people who are prone to laughter, that's pushing it, or intemperance. And by intemperance, we mean, he means not only relation to like alcohol, but also giving into your desires. And a classic example he gives is the example of Zeus. And at line 390C, he talks about Zeus desiring his spouse, the goddess Hera, so much that he must possess her right there, wherever they were. I think they were like in the hallway. Like Plato says, come on, can't you wait till you get to the bedroom? No, Zeus has to do it right then and there. And he says, this is disgusting. This is not the kind of stuff we need to be showing the guardians. I mean, are you kidding? No, I mean, this is the king of the gods, by the way, This leads to one of the more substantive or consequential philosophical debates of the Republic, which is, he says that the poets and all artists for that matter, they employ imitation. The Greek is mimesis. Mimetic is an adjective. Sometimes you hear the word mimetic arts. Mimetic means imitative arts. According to Plato, and this is the claim you're going to have to contend with, according to Plato, all art is imitation. It's all imitation, okay? We're going to take that on. The poets, however, he zeroes in on around 393b. And see, the poets, they are trying to imitate events and characters. And he gives an example from the Iliad where Homer, he doesn't try to get us to speak as someone other than himself. That's a quote from 393b. In other words, Homer puts on the voice of someone else. He tries to take on the voice of someone else to make us think that we are listening to the person himself. This is an example of imitation, according to Plato. He tells us 394c, tragedy and comedy work wholly through imitation as well. So tragedy, so we've talked about what are some of the major arts that he's dealing with. Well, on one hand, you have epic poetry, of course, and that is, the examples are the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer, probably around 800 BCE. These would have been in oral tradition that would have been shared among people for a very long time. We're going to see there's an interesting discussion in the Phaedrus that's coming about. It's funny how people, every generation, there are these doomsayers about technology, right? Oh, technology is making people weak. I don't know if we discussed it in this class, but I know I talked about this in one of my classes, but the people saying, there was an article written a few years ago about how GPS on our phones has made it so that we are losing a natural sense of orientation, right? We don't know. My son is an example of this. I've driven him to Target for years, but then when it was his turn, he got lost. It's about a mile from my home. And I'm like, what the fuck have you been doing all this time? You just like looking at your phone? I mean, do you not look around and notice trees and geography? And so very good question, is technology ensuring that certain parts of our brain are unused? In the Phaedrus, Socrates is going to lament a new technology called writing. Writing, the new technology of writing. And what is the problem with the new technology of writing? People will not have to remember as much. They'll get lazy. They'll just write shit down. Well, reason I'm bringing this up is because epic poetry entailed tremendous memory. Think about it. When this art form was shared, these were people reciting this from memory, and this would have taken, I don't know, a very long period of time, like hours on end. They could recite these poems, the stories of the Iliad. And then Homer writes this down, and he writes the definitive experience, the definitive account, I should say. Cameron, why did you write the Unabomber? I don't understand.
He was like very, very, very like distinct about his opinions and like the way technology will progress to an eventual cataclysm, a singularity when like the artificial intelligence will outperform humans, and that's why he did what he did, because he thought that he was trying to stop the gradual progression of technology.
Good. Okay, now I understand. Okay, thank you. Good. The other art forms he's thinking of, epic poetry, the other is tragedy and comedy. Tragedy, we've already discussed the great tragedy, one of the best known, Oedipus Rex. Tragedy and comedy were very important art forms in ancient Athens. There were three great tragic writers, okay? They were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Sophocles, I think, is the best known. He wrote Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Colonus. He also writes Antigone. Oedipus, and by the way, just as you had three philosophers, one taught the other, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, you have three tragedians who kind of handed the baton to one another. Whether they trained one another, I don't know, but chronologically they come in this order. Aeschylus was the oldest, then Sophocles, then Euripides. They all lived in Athens around the same time as Plato. Tragedy was very important, right? The Greeks built these very impressive theaters. I don't know if you guys studied these theaters in your art history class, but you guys know what was remarkable about the architecture of these ancient Greek theaters? They put a lot of care into them. Acoustics. Yeah, you know what the point is about their acoustics? What's special about their acoustics, Lauren? Anybody?
Did that have something to do with like the amphitheater made it so that it was easier to hear? I don't really remember. It's been a while.
I mean, they're open aired, right? And you could sit anywhere in that theater and hear the people on stage, perfect clarity, without yelling. So I don't know anything more than that. I just want to point out that the Greeks were awesome engineers when it came to theaters, and they put a lot of care and concern into this. This was an extremely important outing for them. Historians of theater point out that early tragedy was actually born out of religious ceremony. So this was hugely important to them. And Aristotle, of course, writes a very famous book about the purpose of theater, which I'm happy to talk about later. But again, so these are the major art forms he's thinking of. And he says what they all have in common is that they are imitation. The authors who make them are engaged in imitation. And so this leads them all to ask the question, should they allow tragedy and comedy, and by way of that poetry, into the ideal city? In other words, do they want the guardians to be imitators? This is the question at 394E. Do they want the guardians to be imitators? And I'm gonna point out his response here, and you all take a look at this passage. This is a pretty key passage, 394E. Socrates says, consider, Adeimantus, whether our guardians should be imitators or not. Or does this also follow from an earlier statement that each individual would do a fine job of one occupation, not of many, and that if he tried the latter and dabbled in many things, he'd surely fail to achieve distinction in any of them? He would. Then doesn't the same argument also hold for imitation? A single individual cannot imitate many things as well as he can imitate one. No, he can't. Then he'll be hardly able to pursue any worthwhile way of life while at the same time imitating many things and being an imitator. Even in the case of two kinds of imitation that are thought to be closely akin, such as tragedy and comedy, the same people aren't able to do both of them well. So the word I was searching for earlier is multitasking. He's understanding imitators, they're like multitaskers. I'm surprised he doesn't talk about actors as much. I mean, he talks about Homer trying to portray the voice of someone to make you think, oh, I'm really listening to Achilles. Tell me about this battle from a first person perspective. But he should have talked about actors, like an actor portraying another person, right? An actor portraying a role. That's literally trying to be another person. And that's not cool, according to Plato. Because in this republic, you do one job. You don't do one job and then another and imitate another. You do one job, right? And the fact that artists are imitating it all suggests they don't really do anything particular, right? Which leads to his famous conclusion at 397e. I had you guys write about this last week. He says we need to ban the poets. Well, here actually, I'm gonna read the opening here because this really problematizes or emphasizes the problem he sees. This is 397e. But do you think that it harmonizes with our Constitution because no one in our city is two or more people simultaneously, since each one does only one job? Indeed, it doesn't harmonize. And isn't it because of this that it's only in our city that we'll find a cobbler who is a cobbler, and not also a captain alongside with his cobbling, and a farmer who's a farmer, and not also a juror along with his farming, and a soldier who's a soldier, and not a moneymaker in addition to his soldiering? That's true. It seems then that if a man who through clever training can become anything and imitate anything should arrive in our city wanting to give a performance of his poems, we should bow down before him as someone wholly wonderful and pleasing, but we should tell him there is no one like him in our city and that it isn't lawful for there to be one. We should pour myrrh on his head, crown him with wreaths, and send him away to another city. But for our own good, we should ourselves employ a more austere and less pleasure-giving poet. So to answer Cameron's point earlier, that, about specific artists, what kind of artists we should have in the city, they should be less austere. They should be austere and less pleasure-giving. So if that is your thing, then you are a Plato's artist. But look at that description there of the poets, right? If a poet comes, what are we going to do? We're going to bow down before him. We're going to pour myrrh on his head, crown him with wreaths, send him on his way. In other words, we're going to treat him like, oh, wow, you guys know what myrrh is? What's myrrh? Anybody know what myrrh is? That's one of the things they gave the baby Jesus at the Three Kings. In the ancient Mediterranean, when you poured oil on someone's head, that was an honorific. That's where we get the word anointed from. I thought it was a spice, but maybe it's like a scented oil. In any case, they're treating this guy like a god, right? Oh my God, the poet comes into town like, whoa, oh my God, this is amazing. I hear you do amazing work. Here's a wreath and myrrh. Can you get the fuck out? Right? You are amazing. Now leave. Right? You're great, but we don't want you. Right? Anybody have any thoughts or questions about what's going on here? Any questions, comments? It's all right. We're going to have plenty of time to deal with this. I'm going to move on here because I want to get to the end of book 3 by the end of today. For sure. Get us started in book 4. From the literary arts, he goes on to talk about music, 399. Some of you wrote about this. Actually, I think many of you wrote about this last week, if not all of you. You know, what kind of music do they want? Well, he says, line 399, music should imitate the tone and rhythm of courageous people and moderate people. Great question. What is music for courageous people? I think we can come up with some examples. Maybe heavy metal. Something pretty loud, right? What kind of music do you want on your headphones as you go into battle, right? That's my question. I mean, it's got to be something that's going to get you revved up. But then the other question is Weezer. I really doubt it. But then the other question is, I would suggest some Motley Crue, maybe. But then the other question is, what kind of music makes for a moderate person, right? How do you imitate, what kind of music makes you moderate? And by moderate, again, he means temperate, like even keel, like you don't give in to your desires. You're like, I got things under control. I could go gorge on that chocolate cake, or I'm gonna Nickelback for courage. Is that what I'm to understand? I doubt it. Any ideas on what kind of music to listen to for the moderate soul? That's a good question. Weezer. Yeah, probably. I think you're right. But here's the point, right? Why should we be listening to this kind of music? You need to be listening to the kind of music that you want your soul to be. You want a courageous soul? That's the music for you. You want modesty? You listen to that. So art should not be about imitation. It should be about reality. What do you want? That's what it delivers. But then this leads to my favorite passage, which is about the visual arts. Now, you all are visual artists here, right? So what does Plato have to say about visual arts? Well, it is a little bit tricky, right? So one of the groups you guys were talking about, you think that like Plato, when it comes to visual arts, he might favor something like Stalinist realism. I don't know. I think of, when I think of Stalinist art, I think of this gigantic architecture, these massive places, these massive buildings, Stalinist sculpture. I'm going to use my technology today and pull up a picture. Stalinist sculpture. Here we go. Let me share, everybody. Oh, Lauren, I see your hand. Let me just share this and then where's my Stalinist sculpture? Here we go. Here you go. There's your Stalinist sculpture, everybody. Look at that. Why did Stalin want that kind of sculpture?
Aestheticizes violence in its pro-state.
Yeah. Some of the ones that I always remember are the ones celebrating workers, The reason I'm Izzy, yeah, that guy was kind of a Hulk, huh? Stalinist sculpture is not implicit. It's very explicit. It's very in your face. You will see, I'll post this for you all for next week. One of my favorite, or maybe not favorite, but just like one of the most iconic Stalinist sculptures is I think one is like it's three workers, and you know exactly what the professions are. One is a farmer, one is a miner, and then I think another is a factory worker, you know. And Stalinist is clearly celebrating the working class, right? His architecture is meant to impress. It's meant to convey power. It is also meant to elevate the proletariat, okay? Lauren, what were you gonna say?
Like when Plato talks about how like he wants art, it almost seems like he wants art that makes people appreciate sort of rational beauty and just reason in general. And it kind of fits the sculpture that we just saw, as well as like Greek sculpture in general, because like with like Stalinist work, it's all very pro power and strength and things like that. And like by this, I don't know how Greek sculpture kind of progresses, but at least at one point in time, Greek sculpture really prioritized like perfect mathematical human bodies. So power as beauty and reason as beauty as well. So
Nice.
definitely fits the time.
Yeah, good. Awesome. Yeah, that Hulk I showed you all, that is not beauty really, right? That's like rough hewn, and boy, you don't want to rumble. Maybe I'll share with you a sculpture of some of the sculptures from Olympus. I remember I was in Olympus once many, many years ago. That's where the first Olympic Games were. And I remember there was a row of statues of ancient classical Greek statues, and they are very different from what you're describing, absolutely. But let me call your attention to the key passage about visual arts. I just find this so rich, and it's a shame he doesn't, expand. This is kind of typical for Plato. He's going to leave stuff to your imagination. He tells us here, he won't be too explicit about his message. 401b. Is it then only poets we have to supervise, compelling them to make an image of a good character in their poems, or else not to compose them among us? Or are we also to give orders to other craftsmen, forbidding them to represent, whether in pictures, buildings, or any other works, a character that is vicious, unrestrained, slavish, and graceless? Are we to allow someone who cannot follow these instructions work among us, so that our guardians will be brought up on images of evil, as if in a meadow of bad grass? So artists are going to be under the same compulsion, right? You cannot portray vicious characters. So that our guardians will be brought up on images of evil, as if in a meadow of bad grass, where they crop and graze in many different places every day, until little by little they unwittingly accumulate a large evil in their souls. Or must we rather seek out craftsmen who are by nature able to pursue what is fine and graceful in their work, so that our young people will live in a healthy place and be benefited on all sides, so that something of those fine works will strike their eyes and ears like a breeze that brings health from a good place, leading them unwittingly from childhood on to resemblance, friendship, and harmony with the beauty of reason? And, on one hand, there's something unsurprising here. He's saying, just like the poets, visual artists also have a responsibility. They cannot be portraying, vicious character. But one word that makes its way into this description twice is really strange. It's the word unwitting. God damn it, where's my cursor? Unwittingly, right? He says, the problem with having all these vicious characters portrayed is that the people will unwittingly accumulate a large evil in their souls. And, but positively speaking, the task of visual artists is they should create a healthy place for people where they're benefited on all sides, so that when they hear these, so that these fine works will strike their eyes and ears with a breeze that brings health from a good place, leading them unwittingly from childhood on to resemblance, friendship, and harmony with the beauty of reason. I'm gonna sum it up for you all here. What does art do? What is visual art? Visual art, morally speaking, visual art must bring people unwittingly to the good. Unwittingly. Visual arts must prod people unwittingly to the moral ideal. Why? What would it look like? What does it look like when artists are called on to prod people explicitly and overtly? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure how much of this would be of the time, but it almost seems like the difference between art and propaganda.
Good. Anybody else? I have to tell you, propaganda comes to mind. Sid.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of like political cartoons and how like I feel like those are really like a hit or miss. Like you either agree with it entirely or you're like super averse to it because everything. I don't know. I personally find political cartoons really funny. But that's besides the point. I just think that people are more skeptical of ideas that are just so overtly like being imposed upon them. Whereas like if there's something really subtle in art or in like a demonstration of sort, like they'll more think about it to themselves and kind of question its validity and come to a conclusion that way, as opposed to just saying, yes, I agree with this, or no, I disagree with this.
I love it, Sid. That's a great point. Thank you. Yeah, I think Plato is begging the question, like, why does this have to be unwitting? This suggests he thinks there is something wrong or misguided, or art backfires when it is encouraged to prod people to a specific goal and end or specific ideal. This has got to be unwitting for a specific reason. Cameron.
I was just thinking like how the propaganda would take shape in Plato's life and like the time period they were in. And I think it's super, super doable. And like I was reading, like I know like the aestheticization of war through art is how like the two can become intertwined and get entangled. And like I just can't help but imagine like a statue of like a warrior, right? Like that's aestheticizing like violence and war, and that's like encouraging them to be pro-state, especially if you like put it on like a hyper masculine figure. It's like making people like worship and look up to like the warriors in Plato's life. And I mean, for him, that's not even a bad thing, like for him, that's exactly what he wants. He wants people to like really like think and internalize that the war and like the guardian and all that. And I mean, in his world, I don't know, I don't want to, that's his thing. But I think that the statues of like war and aestheticizing it is definitely a form of propaganda. Also, another side note, I have to leave for work, but
I'm still here.
Anna's still here.
Well, thank God for that. Okay. Two questions to think on. Does propaganda backfire, and how does propaganda backfire? Right? I think Plato is skeptical of propaganda. I think so. I think there's something problematic with it. I can give some examples next week to start us off, that I can think of. I'm not really well versed in propaganda. I remember I've spent plenty of time looking at like propaganda in Maoist China. I'm familiar with some Stalinist propaganda. I mean, the United States has been engaged in plenty of propaganda through the years, I mean, famous campaigns in World War I, World War II with Uncle Sam, like with the German in a headlock. I don't know. It's made that up. I don't remember. You know, but I think he's skeptical of propaganda. There, you know, somehow propaganda backfires, which is why visual arts, the best they can do to prod people to a specific end is they have to do this unwittingly. And I just think that's a fascinating philosophical question. You know, how would art do this? How? Because at the end of the day, why is he spending all this time talking about art? Because he believes that art is, you know, crucially important to politics. We can't talk about a healthy political state without discussing the role that art plays. Art can make or break a state. Art can make or break a city. But you must be careful. The kind of art you will enlist for the state, you must be careful. You may not be overt. You may not be in people, you know, your image, your ideal cannot be in people's face. Human nature will rebel against that. All right, I'm gonna wrap things up here. I'm gonna take about 10 minutes to do this, okay? Because I want to make sure we're at the very end of book 3 here. 2 last things to discuss. The ruling class is introduced. This is the 3rd class. They're introduced around 413, 414. He says, you know, how, and again, their nature is going to betray them as such, right? Just as the artisans were determined by their nature and the guardians were determined by their nature. He says at 413E, he says if someone is hard to put under a spell, is apparently gracious in everything, is a good guardian of himself, and music and poetry has learned, and if he always shows himself to be rhythmical and harmonious, then he is the best person both for himself and for the city. Anyone who is tested in this way as a child, youth, and an adult, and always comes out of it untainted, is made a ruler as well as a guardian. So exemplary guardians, and we're going to hear a lot more. This is just the very beginning about what distinguishes them. There's a lot. He has a lot more to say about the soul of the ruler. That's part of your reading for next week, book 7. And this leads into the question, we're going to talk about the rulers at the very end of book 3. He has some rather shocking prescriptions for them. But before we get into the prescriptions for their lifestyle, he says he wants to talk about another false story. He says, you know, the question comes up, how do we sustain the guardians and properly educate them and keep them on the right track? There is a concern among the men that the guardians might be diverted. They might doubt that they are guardians. They might doubt their role. And he says we have to tell them a myth. We have to tell them a myth, a false story. We must tell them a myth to really make sure that their understanding of their nature is ingrained. So there is, you know, this raises a question. That there is something that he is worried. The guys, you know, Socrates is worried that people are not going to buy into the basic and foundational point of the Republic. And don't forget that basic foundational point is this essentialism. You have one job for your nature. He's worried that people will not buy this. So that raises a question, why won't people buy this? Okay, something to think about. But in order to kind of counteract that, we get this myth at 415A, and this is called the myth of the metals. So you're going to see this. There are 2 major myths that come up in the Republic. Very important. Myth is a major target for him. He's very critical of myth, but he's going to offer his own. Okay? And we saw myth already at the end of the Gorgias. So let me walk you through this myth at 415 A through D. Is that where I am? Yeah. All of you in the city are brothers, we'll say to them in telling our story. But the God who made you mixed some good into those who are adequately equipped to rule, because they are most valuable. He put silver in those who are auxiliaries, and iron and bronze in the farmers and other craftsmen. For the most part, you will produce children like yourselves, but because you are all related, A silver child will occasionally be born from a golden parent, and vice versa, and all the others from each other. So the first and most important command from the God to the rulers is that there's nothing that they must guard better or watch more carefully than the mixture of metals in the souls of the next generation. If an offspring of theirs should be found to have a mixture of iron or bronze, they must not pity him in any way, but give him the rank appropriate to his nature and drive him out to join the craftsmen and farmers. But if an offspring of these people is found to have a mixture of gold or silver, they will honor him and take him up to join the guardians of the auxiliaries. For there is an oracle which says the city will be ruined if it ever has iron or bronze guardian. This is the myth of the metals. What's the point? What's the message of the myth?
The myth is that, what was it? So society can't be blamed for societal classes. It's derived from the gods and what they tell the oracle.
Okay, good. Thank you. Can I hear some more? Anybody else? What else would you say about the message of this myth?
To put it in basic terms, the myth implies that one's fate is immutable, just like the metals cannot be extracted or mixed in the soul or journeyed.
And if you're golden and your child is silver, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to your silver child, everybody? Hello?
Will the silver child, oh, sorry, did somebody talk?
Oh, I was just gonna say that they would move down in the class system.
You're going to lose your child. Yeah, oh, I see Audrey now. Your class is parent tied to your soul. In practical terms, this means if you are a guardian and you have a child who is a baker, you will lose that child. Or a ruler for that matter, right? Right, to emphasize, again, the point being this, and the men asked the question, Plato asked the question, like, they suspect some guardians won't even believe this myth, right? And again, people will not, may be skeptical, or people may not abide by the major premise of doing the job you're supposed to do according to your nature, right? This is not going to be something that people are going to stick to. Again, why are they concerned about this? Plato is concerned about it because he thinks it's a real concern. Even so, what's funny is, like, again, I'll go back to this point over and over again. You have to be careful with Plato, okay? I'm not sure he's utopian. I'm really not. I think this is an exercise, right? If you want a utopian society, what kind of sacrifices are you going to have to make? What kind of hard decisions are you going to have to make? Are you going to want to make these decisions? On the flip side, are people capable of the kind of, rigid definitions or distinctions or perfection? Are people really capable of that? Would you really want to live in a utopia, right? He's suggesting this is what a utopia would take. This is going to be a hard fit. We're almost going to have like a magic potion, like a myth that's going to make them believe this shit, and it's going to be hard. But I want us to also consider, I think the question he's also asking us is it worth it, right? Let me move on to this last point here. Actually, before I do that, let me pause for a second, see if anybody has any questions or comments about anything. Anybody have anything they want to say?
It does seem that Socrates here is only half serious about his definition of this utopia, since his utopia requires some obstruction of knowledge and truth, which he talked
Why do you say
about
obstruction?
extensively. He wants people to believe things that are not true, their ideals.
Yeah.
One thing also, and like I don't really know how valid this is, but like they don't set out, like at least Socrates and the rest of the people in the actual dialogue don't actually set out to make a utopia at first. They set out to figure out justice, and then they kind of run into creating a utopia in the process.
Yeah, why is that? That suggests that because they want to see justice. And that suggests that you only see justice in the ideal city. In the real city, you don't. Ugh, that's not nice. But I mean, that's the way we talk about justice too, right? Normally at this point, if we were in the classroom at Micah, I would point out the window and say, here's Baltimore. Do you see justice? And you don't. There ain't not much justice in Baltimore. But justice is an aspirational goal. It's something you work towards. Maybe you see instances of it, right? It's led a lot of scholars to wonder whether Socrates believes that justice is attainable, you know? So that's a really good point you raised, Lauren. Anybody else? All right, let's touch on this last point here, and then we can break for the day. At the very end of book 3, I know we didn't get into book 4. We'll definitely tackle that next week. That's some good stuff about the nature of the soul. It's Plato's psychology. In book 5, he's going to go into more in depth what we're discussing here at the very end of book 3, which is the provisions, the living provisions for the guardians. Here he mentions them. Book 5, he explains them. And it is, I mean, it's just crazy. I'm just warning you. It's gonna be kind of crazy. So what do we know about the living measures? Well, I'll put it to you all. What are the living measures for the guardians? What does he point out for how these guardians should live? Sonny says between poverty and wealth. All right. Can I have some more specifics, some more details? How should these guardians live? Really? You got nothing here? Come on, he's pretty specific about how these guys will be living. Where will they be living? Who will they be living with? What will their living conditions be? Let's flesh out what Sonny says. What does it mean that they will be living between poverty and wealth? That's a little general. What does that mean?
Socrates says that poverty shouldn't hinder their ability to work as leaders, and neither should wealth spoil them.
And how will we ensure that they live between poverty and wealth? I'm not putting you on the spot, Sonny. This is for anybody. How should we ensure that the guardians live between poverty and wealth? He has a pretty specific prescription for them.
Doesn't he say that they like can't have money or gold or anything?
Yes. Thank you. They should not have property. 416. There you go, Lauren. Why should they not have property? Let's deal with that first. He says essentially, right, you got gold in your souls, or silver. Actually, it says soul. You have silver in your souls. You don't need stuff. There's also a practical reason. Why don't we want, if the Guardians don't have property, who will be sustaining them, everybody?
The state, the system.
Thank you. The craftsmen. They will live without property. They will live on the munificence of the state. Everything they have, they will hold in common. They will share in common. They must live in a communist lifestyle, the Guardians, that is. And why is that? Well, there is a practical reason. You guys know what the practical reason is? Why don't we want soldiers owning property and having gold and silver? Why might it be a good idea to bar them from that?
Keep them in line.
Keep them in line? How so?
To maintain them at a level of poverty where they need the state in order to survive.
Good. You don't want soldiers getting a taste for stuff and money, right? And Audra says so they don't have to waste energy managing their state or wealth, right? We don't want them having jobs. What do they do all day? They fucking train. They train. They become the most vicious soldiers of all time. Let everybody bake for them and butcher for them and cobble, whatever. Right. Lauren points out the other provisions are laid out at 416. They will have no private property. They will have no private housing. They will live in common messes. They will live together in a common mess. They will have no money of their own. They'll live off the state. Yeah, that's pretty much it. These are just the basics. Book 5, we get some great details. They will not get married. Oh, but they will have children. How will we decide this? Well, they will live in a giant family. What the fuck are you talking about, right? So that's what's coming. It's getting very nutty in book 5. I'm just warning you, okay? So there we have it. We got to the end of book 3 now. Next week, we'll pick up book 4 and 5 for sure. And you do have a little bit of book 7 to read. The part of book 7 is called The Allegory of the Cave. So very famous story in, I guess that is that a myth? I don't know. That's a question. It's an allegory. Maybe more metaphorical than anything. You know, it's interesting to think about how Plato is his criticism of art and poetry in light of all the poetic license he takes, you know. Again, I think it has to do with how he recognizes how politically and morally significant and powerful art is. You know, art must be a concern of those in power. It must be. Cannot be ignored. It must be co-opted in some way, but not overtly, right? Propaganda is a problem. This might be an interesting research topic for somebody to write about at the end of the class. Like, what is the problem with propaganda for Plato? Why is propaganda different from what he has in mind here, for what he's proposing? You know, if you think propaganda is effective, that means you think something specific about human nature. You would think that people are susceptible to it. What is it about human nature that makes Plato skeptical that they're not susceptible to propaganda, right? That answer is coming next week. We're going to talk about human nature. You're going to see his theory of the human soul, which is very famous as well. Okay, so I am done. We are skipping book 6. You are welcome to do it to read it. Listen, I forgot to mention this. If you have the edition that I've ordered here, at the opening of each chapter, there is a little bit of a summary. So that might be helpful for you to read, to look at, like if you're not reading book 6, but you can read one page about it and you basically know. These summaries are not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. You know, there's always hidden things with Plato, but this gives you the lay of the land at least. Where are you guys finding these audiobooks? Audible. Is this the series that who is the voice on that? Anybody know who the reader is? No? Nobody famous? I don't know this one. I mean, I guess if it helps, it's okay. But you know, again, you are going to be missing on the line numbers. You know, so if at all possible, you know, check them over again or do them in tandem when possible. Ray Childs, I don't know who that is. I was wondering. I was going to make a joke and say, is this the Robert Downey Jr. version? But that's just stupid. Sorry, stupid jokes. Okay, that would be kind of funny though if he narrated The Republic. So I'm done. Peace out. I'm going to stick around if anybody wants to talk to me. Okay. All right. Have a great week, people. Oh, I got one announcement. Whoops, sorry. I'm on the radio on Thursday. So if you're interested, I'm on Baltimore NPR. Talk about my new book about privacy. I'll send you all an announcement if you're interested. Okay. You can listen while you do whatever you do. Okay. Bye, everybody. Take care. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good question.
Yeah, go for it.
So is it okay if I do the weekly response a bit late today? I know I might get points taken off, but
Not much. Go ahead and do them. Yeah, absolutely. It's always better to do them than not. I will always give you some credit. And if you get it to me today, there won't be much of a deduction for sure.
Okay, thank you.
All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye. Hello?